I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't at least mention this, but in the last week, Belgium has been shook by the murder of a homosexual man by a couple of teens. And I can't help wondering, what makes people think that this is okay? That it's a justifiable thing to attack people and to kill them for their sexuality? I can't believe this is still something that needs to be reiterated like this, but apparently it is. So I want to say very clearly, first of all, homosexuality, your sexuality in general, is not something you choose. If it was, with all the hate there is, I think many of them would choose to just not be homosexual. With all this hate, it's just not worth it. But more importantly, not only is it not something you choose, it's also not something that's in any way a bad thing. And it certainly isn't a justifiable reason to attack people, and let alone to kill them. Killing people for their sexuality does not make you a better person. It just makes you a bleep. Hello there, I'm Simon. Welcome to my channel. Today's topic is another chapter in the history of GRSM. Coincidentally, this week was also International Women's Day, or as my cousin says, International Day of the Fight for Women's Rights. So we don't lose sight of the actual purpose. So even though I'm like a week late with this, I want to talk about a lady called Mary Wollstonecraft. She lived from 1759 to 1797 Anno Domini. But you don't need to remember that. This won't be on the exam. What you do need to know is that she was one of the first feminists. Oh, you thought the first feminists were the suffragettes in like the beginning of the 20th century. Well, they were. Sorta. The suffragettes was an organized movement for, well, women's suffrage, women's right to vote. And they were in the first wave of feminism. But they weren't quite the start. Neither was Mary Wollstonecraft, but she was very early on. The thing with questions like who was the first blank is that very often there isn't one solid beginning. It's more like a progression where it's very, very difficult to pin down where exactly the point is where you can speak of the blank in question. But I'll probably be making a dedicated video about the history of feminism in the future. All that to say that Mary Wollstonecraft was an early feminist. Now, what you need to realize is that at this time, the French Revolution was happening, which meant the end of what we call the Ancien Régime, aka the ancient regime, or the old rule. Basically, this largely meant the end of feudalism and the beginning of democracy. Again, there's not really a solid point that we can pinpoint where this change happened, but the French Revolution is one of the most solid of those historical points that there are. Anyway, these are also the days of the Enlightenment, which means that people were starting to question the old ideas and started idolizing reason and logic as the leading principles. And people were starting to realize that that meant that perhaps humans might actually have some basic rights. A very novel concept indeed. And Mary was one of the first to continue that thought to women as well. And so in 1789, some guy called Lafayette, amongst others, drafted the Déclaration des droits de l'homme et du citoyen, aka the Declaration of the Rights of Men and the Civilian. And I think you can already spot the slight problem there, but I'll get to that. So, as a result of the revolution, some guy called Edmund Burke published a pamphlet, because pamphlets were all the rage in intellectual circles as a tool for debate. So he published a pamphlet called Reflections on the Revolution in France, defending and supporting the Ancien Régime. And so Mary Wollstonecraft, the person this video is supposed to be about, replied to that with her own pamphlet called A Vindication of the Rights of Men, which seems to suffer the same problem as the Déclaration des Droits. Namely, it's rather focused on men, because, you know, default settings, I guess. But she seems to have realized that there needed to be more focus on the rights of women, and so she published The Vindication of the Rights of Women. Now, not unlike her daughter, Mary Shelley, who would go on to write Frankenstein, she also wrote some fiction. Well, sorta. She wrote 2 novels, one of which remained unfinished, and both of them seem to be mostly a critique of the patriarchy. Which is fair. I mean, the patriarchy needs to just stop. The first novel is called Mary, a Fiction, and the other, Maria, or The Wrongs of Women. She doesn't seem to have been very creative with names there. Anyway, she ended up marrying a guy called William Godwin, a philosopher with anarchistic ideas, which makes sense, considering Mary herself was a bit of an anarchist as well, except her anarchy was more aimed towards the patriarchy. She died soon after the birth of their daughter, who was creatively called Mary. But hang on, why am I even talking about Mary Wollstonecraft? I mean, she's awesome, but this is supposed to be a series about the history of the GRSM community. What does Mary have to do with all that? Well, about that. Apart from just being an early feminist, Mary Wollstonecraft is also considered to have been polyamorous. Polyamory is perhaps one of the lesser known facets of the LGBTQ+ kaleidoscope. I mean, it seems to be less prominent than some other facets anyway. So I should probably try to explain what it actually is. Basically, poly means many in Greek, and amory is of course derived from the Latin amor, which means love. So it means many lovers, basically. Now that might sound like this is the whole friends with benefits idea. But while there's nothing wrong with friends with benefits, I mean, if you can make it work, bleeping go for it. But as I understand it, that's actually kind of the opposite. Because friends with benefits, as far as I understand it, is all about having the benefits, without actually having a relationship. Whereas polyamory is all about actually having that relationship. It's just with more than one person. I should probably point out that polyamory is actually just one of the ways to be non-monogamous. And it turns out that that's a very complicated topic, as this graph will no doubt show. Look, whatever you do, just make sure you communicate honestly with everyone involved. I mean, I don't know much about relations, but one thing I do know is that, as I said, honest communication is vital. So basically, don't go using polyamory as an excuse to cheat on your partner. That's not how it works. Also, there is some debate about whether or not polyamory actually belongs in the LGBTQIA+ community, because it's not really an identity thing as much as a behavior thing. But for the purposes of this video, I'm assuming it is. So now that we know what polyamory is, I suppose we are left with 2 questions. Number 1, was Mary Wollstonecraft polyamorous? And number 2, does it actually matter? So, did she ever engage in a romantic relationship with more than one person at a time? Well, as far as I can find, there doesn't seem to be anything solid. I mean, it's definitely possible. She's been single for quite a while, and in that time, she came into regular contact with a lot of intellectuals, of exactly the type that we know she was attracted to, from relationships we do know she had. So it's certainly possible that she did enter into a polycular relationship with some of them, but if she did, there's no evidence. The closest I can find is her relationship with a guy called Henry Fuseli. He was a painter from Switzerland, and she fell head over heels in love with him. Of course, Fuseli had a wife, Sophia, but the heart wants what the heart wants. She later told Godwin that she never had a physical relationship with him, but it is pretty clear that, at least at a platonic level, she was in love with him. To such an extent, in fact, that the relation climaxed in Mary proposing a sort of 3-person marriage with herself and the Fuselis. Essentially, what she proposed was for Henry to become a bigamist. It seems she was not so much interested in a relationship with Henry's wife as she was in a relationship between herself and Henry. So rather than being polyamorous, in this case she was mostly just desperately looking for a way for herself to have that relationship with the guy she loved. At least that's my interpretation. As far as I can find, there is nothing else in her life to suggest a polyamorous lifestyle. Of course, just because I can't find it doesn't mean there's nothing there. So if you know of something that I missed, please let me know down below. So Mary may have been polyamorous, but there's no way to actually know one way or the other. But if you are hoping for this video to have a happy ending, which I guess would just be an answer in the affirmative, don't click away just yet, because there is a plot twist. Because you know who was actually polyamorous? Mary's daughter, Mary Shelley, you know, the one who wrote Frankenstein. Incidentally, both Marys are actually often called Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, which is probably the main reason for this idea. Did I just base an entire video on a mix-up? Have I been looking into Mary Wollstonecraft when I should have been looking into Mary Shelley? Well, that's what you get with all those Marys. It does make things a lot simpler though, because Shelley and her husband, Percy Shelley, and their close friend, Lord Byron, are super famous for having had a very open love life. Like, they encouraged each other to date other people. I'm not gonna go into it now, because it's about time for the YouTube thing. But if you want to look into it, like, this is all over the place. So I think you'll have a field day. Now let's do the YouTube thing. You know the drill, peeps. Comment, like, subscribe, ring the bell, share the video, all that jazz. Let's be honest, this is not your first YouTube video, so there's not really any point in me elaborating on it. Oh, by the way, I realize now that I actually forgot to answer the second question. Does it actually matter? So, that's your homework. Put your answer in the comments. Why am I still talking? One more thing. Thanks for watching.